history, I mean, because history is everything. Everything up until a second ago is history, right? And unless we want to sort of fall into the idea of like pure free will and stuff, we are just shaped by everything that everybody did before. So history is everything. If you want to understand all of the stuff that seems mercurial and mystical and weird about the world today, look at what made us get to this point, right? And so the reason I think history is interesting is because like human beings are interesting, but also like what have human beings been doing and why and how. So making sense of stuff, right, is kind of the thing that really sort of gets me going. So whenever a historical period, for example, is like referenced in design, there's a very sort of clear turn off switch for me, which is like, did you understand the source material to the point where you could explain it in a way that would make it cool in the way that it was cool to the original users of that aesthetic?
Please welcome concept artist Mehl Amundsen to this episode of the Learn Squared podcast. Evan is an iconic artist in the industry with a jaw-dropping body of work and world building through his own IP, Tine. And in this wide-ranging episode, Evan brings his infectious energy and takes us on a journey of creative philosophy, design, games, jogging, why he swears by aesthetics guided by concept and not the other way around, as well as some lovely history lessons and plenty more. Let's go. Let's go. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Learn Squared podcast. Delighted to welcome on the iconic Mehl Amundsen. Welcome, sir.
Cheers.
Welcome to the podcast. Looking forward to just geeking out about all of your artistry and all the great stuff that you do. But if you wouldn't mind just letting everybody know, and also people who are completely new to this space and this world and to yourself, who you are and what you do.
So I'm from Norway. I do mostly character design, concept design in general. Work mostly in like fantasy, some in sci-fi. I do some like world building on my own part, and sort of been doing this for like 15 years now. I don't know. Like I worked on some things you might have seen, like Assassin's Creed Valhalla is like the one that I can usually say that people actually know.
Fair enough.
But yeah, work mostly in pre-production, so a lot of the sort of sitting down and like explaining to people why my ideas are better than their ideas, and then having long and intricate argumentation for why that is. Also gone to like a bunch of like workshops and done lectures on like principles of concept design, so that kind of thing. But yeah.
Cool. That was my first introduction to yourself. I think it's industry workshops. I don't know if I still forget the year, which I should remember because that was my first introduction to not only yourself but a lot of this space in general. But I think it was 2017, and yeah, saw your work. I was like, wow. I remember like for like 2 seconds saying, "Hey, your work's awesome, man!" Like probably a lot of people do as well. And ever since then, it's obviously just been epic to see the journey and the stuff and the legacy that you've created. You mentioned obviously like 15 years or so. That's definitely like a healthy amount of a career. That's a legit career. When you began, did you kind of foresee that it's going to be something that's going to last that long? And obviously, did you want it to even last that long?
Well, I mean, I'd like it to last as long as it can, like, like being from Norway is kind of weird because most of my friends who are artists are people, from the US or from England or from like, Europe or other parts of the world. And a lot of places you have to be very determined to become an artist. Like it has to be kind of your calling, and it's sort of everyone has kind of like quite a romantic tale of how they became an artist. But in Norway, we like the education system just allows you, if you want to like start specializing towards like art and design and stuff when you're like 15, 16. And that doesn't mean that you're not necessarily going to end up doing art or design, but like you can just kind of lean into that. And then after like high school, you can, in secondary school, you can kind of, you can go to like state subsidized like art school, which I did. And then after that, I mean, only really after that. So when I was like 21-ish, did I kind of have to have like a choice moment where it was like, oh, you want to keep pushing this? Like you want to keep trying? And so like my parents were very good like guiding figures in that, because they were never sort of against it. They were always like, yeah, you just keep trying until like if it gets too rough, like you could always like step back and like go into like engineering or whatever, because they're both engineers, so they always see that as like, you know, the sort of standby like fallback position, which is always flattering. It's like wherever I moved, my mom would always like look up like good math classes just in case.
Okay,
Like
just to
make sure you keep up your math grades, because then you can do engineering, which is good. Yeah, no. So like when I started out, I mean, the first jobs was like when I was after art school. I went to England to try and like get a degree. Turning out that I was a pretty bad like academic student, so I did freelance on the side when I got like bored with classes I didn't agree with. And that like I would take up like little jobs. So that's where like the career stuff started. And so I don't know that I like visualized like a great career back then. It was more like I had fallen in love with this website called conceptart.org, which was it felt very guerrilla back in the day. You know, like it was not like, it wasn't DeviantArt, and it wasn't like CG Hub. It was like this little dinky like I don't know, maybe you were on there. But it was like a dinky little community on like a forum page. Like it was real basic, but it was all the bigs in that industry were there.
Yeah.
So it felt like you suddenly had, you know, Alice in Wonderlanded yourself into this place where you got to like interact with these people who were legends in the field, and it was awesome. And then little by little, you post on there, you got feedback, and sometimes like the big guys will come and like feedback your sketchbook, you'd be like, oh my god. So you sort of just like tumble into this industry, because it's still, you know, it's still a young industry technically. So yeah, like my career was, like it's, you know, it's been like a lot of work and stuff, but it was never sort of pre-visualized. I never really got that degree or set out on that like clear roadmap. It was more like, oh yeah, okay, I'll try a little more. I'll keep drawing. Oh, that's a cool thing over there. I'll try. Oh, look at that. Ooh, go after that.
Sick.
And yeah. Ooh.
Is that still the case? Like, I like the way you describe, like, and I think that's so fitting. Like, a lot of people, and I think maybe a good chunk, I would say 90+%, tumble into this industry. And also come more like a formalized industry now. Back then, concept art was more like a way to describe it, as opposed to maybe like a specific job that you can list for and make a curriculum out of on uni, for example. Do you still kind of like tumble around things? Is that how you still, I guess, would describe how you do your thing?
Off and on. Like there've been a couple of times in the career where I've been sort of chasing stuff. Like when I so like after I went to England and then realized I was a bad academic student, I managed to like land a job in Quebec. So I lived there for 3 years. And when I was there, I felt very sort of like, okay, I'm in the industry now, because I was in a studio. So then you very much feel like, you know, you're climbing that ladder, you're going from junior artist to senior artist. You're getting, you know, you're having conversations about taking on art directional roles and stuff like that. And then, you know, you feel more sort of professional. But then after 3 years of that, I started realizing that like studio life isn't for me. Like it's not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just, it's not, I like having a room to myself and sitting and having sort of long reams of thought and then coming back to like a group and like explaining myself, which works a lot better if you're working separately. So, yeah, like after that, I went to Prague of all places. And then after that, I went to Blizzard, which again, like you sort of come on this like, okay, this is professional again. I got to try and like climb this thing. I got to try and be like, you know, get after it. But then after, like, I only managed like 6 months at Blizzard. And then again, like the whole like, oh no, I am definitely not cut out for the studio life thing kind of hit. And so I ran away and got to Copenhagen and took refuge. And ever since then, it's been sort of like moving from project to project and sort of going after what is fun and what is available, but mostly just trying to go for things where they'll let me. I was very tempted to use that the worst of all terms, like let me do my thing. But allow me to like work in a way where I can sort of argue my concepts, which I think is it's definitely the way I like to work, where it's sort of aesthetic guided by concept rather than concept guided by aesthetic.
I like how you described both ways, like the kind of the holy grail of like someone doing their thing, but also kind of like not the cringe way, but it kind of this kind of like weird goal of what it actually is. And I don't think it works both ways for different people. It's like for some people, doing their own thing is just not what they want to do, or when they try and do it, it's like, this isn't for me. But obviously the flip side is like, no, this is like heaven, like this is everything, like, like the central of my universe, so to speak. But at the same time, some people don't even listen to that conversation or try and answer those kind of questions. So if they're like in a particular place, like say in studio, like you said, or in freelance, okay, this is working, I don't want to, rock the boat, so to speak, let's just stick with it, whether it's a good thing or not. Did you have those kind of conversations, or did you need to see which side was, which it was like, for example?
No, I mean to a certain degree, it's more. It was never that it was fractious or confrontational or any of that stuff.
Right.
It was more, especially like I think it was crystallized to me, being in the U.S., being in California, where and I do sort of get misquoted on saying like, oh, Evan hates California, and I don't. Like a lot of lovely people I worked with over there. No, yeah, well, because I mean, part of the reason why I left California after 6 months was because I did not. I mean, it's not like, when I said I didn't fit in, it wasn't that like I felt alone or whatever. It was more that it was just there's a way of succeeding in those kinds of studios, or in like Blizzard was where I was at, so I can only really speak to that experience, and it's probably different in different studios. But there is it might be an American cultural thing. I think it's more of like a Californian culture thing, from what I've understood. But it's that there is a maneuver element. It sort of operates like a little bit like warfare, and I can understand why. Like because it's a lot of highly effective, highly motivated, highly skillful people, all of them wanting to be like first to run this machine that produces amazing things. Like Blizzard Cinematic is a machine that produces amazing things. But if you don't necessarily care that much about the machine, and you just kind of came to do a job you thought seemed very interesting, and then it turns out the job is something else, it sort of becomes impingent on you at some point to cut your losses and be like, yeah, okay, I misunderstood. That's my bad. I'm gonna get out of here. And so looking back at that, or looking back at, I had like a short stint at IO in Denmark. I had I had 3 years in Quebec. Quebec was great for me because I learned so much. Like I worked with some people who were willing to put up with my argumentativeness, and sort of rein me in a bit and sort of teach me stuff. And that was great. Like I learned tons there. And I think that's true for both Blizzard and IO as well. Like learned lots. But there is a point at which there is learning, and then there's sort of accepting the lessons being presented to you. And I think there's a difference of opinion there. And what I'm specifically talking about there is like how concept design should work. Like I'm of the opinion that it's not like artistic conceptuality, it's conceptual artistry. So it's idea first, concept comes first, which means like form should follow function, not the other way around. You should be designing things out from the idea or the conception that the thing is real. Right, the world that you're designing for has a life of its own. And this is like Mario, right? And even in Mario, like the best designs in Mario come from the acceptance that the Mario world is real and it has its own internal logic. And based on that, like all these things work, So the reason why Mario will make you feel fucking insane sometimes is because they've done that, like from the olden games specifically, where it's like, like the mushrooms and the fucking little feathers and like all of those things have internal mechanistic like ideas for them. That they explain in interviews, and you so sit there and you accept that there's lore here, and you don't actually need to know what those things are for it to have an immersive quality in the game, right? It has to do with the content of the statement. So if an artist, if a production comes to you and they say something and it's truly confident, like you'll believe, even if it's just for a moment, you'll believe, you'll be immersed, right? And then based on everything else that they present, you'll see whether or not they back it up, which is where like the idea of the suspension of disbelief comes in, right? You it's not like you are allowing your will to be, your disbelief to be suspended. It's that based on their will, your disbelief is suspended because they are confident in what they're saying. So your disbelief suspends itself. It's just something that happens reactively. And then based on whether or not they can maintain confidence through subsequent statements, that remains, right? Like that's my idea of a good concept. A lot of concept is aesthetic first. So it's not about bypassing your disbelief. It's about overwhelming you with aesthetic pleasure, right? And this can work. There are instances where I will fully throw up my hands and be like, this is just so pretty. Who fucking cares? You know, like something like Bayonetta. Like Bayonetta does not need logic. You don't need recoil patterns for Bayonetta. Bayonetta is just cool. Like it's pure cool test. You know, whoever designed Bayonetta just went in and was like, am I cool enough? If I just design the way I want to design, like, will people just buy it? And you're like, yes, clearly. So at least like that's my opinion on that one. But I find that most concept design is better approached in the primary, in the concept first. And there's not all that much allowance for that in a lot of studios. A lot of studios have studio heads that have specific aesthetic perceptions, and they want to follow that. And that's fine, but it's also, at least the way I see it, like the road of diminishing returns over time. And it's also a smaller challenge. It's not that interesting to do, which is why, like, when you lock yourself into a studio environment, you're kind of locked in for a long time. And part of the reason why I then like the freelance is that if it turns out that I was wrong when I sign on to a project, which I have been many times, or I have proven to be wrong over time. Not going to mention any particular projects, but there is one in particular that still haunts me because it was so promising, and then they're like, but yeah, like then you can kind of just go, look, okay, I did my best. I'm gonna leave, which is fine, you know, because at least you try, and you get to have fun along the way. So. Rant number 1.
Right. A lot of fascinating things you mentioned there, and a lot of things, like, I guess, different things we can pick apart and explore. But just focusing on, like, concept design specifically, what you just mentioned there, the best approach that you think is, that seems to be something that I definitely agree with. And a lot of the episodes that have happened up to now, like, it's a common thread that seems to, what a lot of people are mentioning and saying, or at least can come into the conclusion of. Why do you think that there is still not so much a battle, but aesthetics does come first?
Because it's sexier. It's pretty simple. Like, because productions are chaotic, because stress, because lack of foresight, you know. There was a great I think Peter Jackson did us all a great favor when he decided to do, like, behind the scenes. I mean, he kind of started that for movies, right? Like behind the scenes documentary things. And I think he did us a great favor. First and foremost, before Lord of the Rings things, like, large part of my not shameful, but like embarrassingly large part of my childhood is sitting and, like, knitting chainmail and watching behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings, like, which explains a lot. But so, like, and watching that first, and then subsequently watching the behind the scenes for The Hobbit. And I harp on about The Hobbit, like, a lot, so please stop me if that gets a lot. But, like, it's such a clear-cut case of the concept following, or, like, form following function versus function following form. That it's just, it blows my mind that it comes from such a similar, like, design group, but just like the circumstances changed everything, you know. So the reason why I think aesthete design sort of wins over conceptual design a lot of the time has to do with, like, time constraints. It has to do with how sexy things look on the paper, and, like, lack of contextuality. So if you look at something like the dwarf designs for The Hobbit, for example, like, if you look at the designs on paper, you go and buy, like, the Hobbit art book, and those designs, like, you can't argue, they look pretty cool. They're the coolest drawings. I'm not going to put anything against that, you know. But the problem is that they designed it for a world that didn't have that rule set, so it doesn't answer the questions that are already in your head when you're going in to watch The Hobbit as a result of having watched Lord of the Rings. And this is, like, just a problem in general with a lot of design, but because they didn't have a lot of time, because they didn't have the kind of friction that sort of created creative gold in Lord of the Rings, they didn't have time to sit down and say, like, maybe a belt made out of, or like a hanging belt thing made out of beard isn't a good look for Bomber, because, like, it's a big rounded design. It's a circle on a circle. And of course that works for Bomber because he's big and fat, you know? Or, like, maybe making Thorin young, even though, like, his entire character is based on being old and, like, crudgety. maybe that's not a good idea. But no, because like young Richard Armitage is sexy, so like it looks better, you know. And there's a lot of that kind of thing. It maybe making Smaug, whose entire personality is supposed to be based on like being a sleeping dragon that wakes up, making him into a lithe and like cool looking worm dragon. Like maybe that's not the best idea. Maybe he should be ugly, because like we're not supposed to think Smaug is cool. We're supposed to think Smaug is fucking terrifying and awful, but he looks amazing, and he's played by Benedict Cumberbatch. Like, how can you not like him? I think that's a big problem with Hobbit in general, is that Hobbit is too fucking cool. Like, the main antagonist is a sexy catman orc with symmetrical scars who just looks dope. Like, he looks like an anime villain. And I mean, that is a cool design. I'm not going to argue that it isn't, but it's not appropriate. It doesn't work, because when it comes to it, you don't know if you're supposed to hate Azog or just kind of go like, ooh, he's cool too. But you don't actually feel anything. When Sauron is on display, you're fully on like, yeah, that is terrifying. And only when you realize that like the helmet is designed around like a horse skull, and you're like, oh, that's why it's so extra creepy. You know, like there's subsets here. There's ideas, right? Like that's a big part of it. The Hobbit looks really cool, but the rule of cool is like the cancer of the Hobbit, is kind of my point. The Lord of the Rings turns out to be very cool because it was effective. So as a result of it being effective, those things became cool. The problem is that like everything that followed took that as the rule of cool and just like put it on everything like ketchup. So why does it still happen? Because doing the other thing is so difficult. It takes so much time and effort and nerding out and caring. And like care is the most like finicky resource we have in design, in art, in anything production, because it demands everything from you, right? Like you have to actually sit there and be like, oh no, we got to do this armor instead of that armor for these like reasons that if I explain them to you, I'm going to sound like a fucking asshole. Like I'm going to sound so weird if I explain it this way. Then I have to make you care about these like reasons, right? Like if I'm to explain to you why I think the armor for Gondor in Lord of the Rings, like it's great armor, it's beautiful armor, it does a lot of the jobs that it's supposed to do. It makes you think of Rome without making you think of Rome, right? Like it's great. However, the Lord of the Rings is supposed to be like a saga, so it's supposed to be set like in a dark age where we don't really have that much information. We have to like deal with like saga, which means chainmail would have been more appropriate, right? And you can make that argument. And it's this kind of thing that you have to do all the way through production in order to do concept first, because idea first means you have to argue ideas, and arguing ideas makes you sound like an asshole. And it's just so much easier to make a cool drawing. And that's what happened to The Hobbit, I think.
Excellent. No, Lord of the Rings, especially the making of, I'm just going to blast through that because I've mentioned it a bazillion times and many episodes. It's just one of the best things ever. Not only just in terms of enjoying it, but as an education. As I was like, I think when I got the DVDs, it must have been about 2000, 2001 after the first one came out. And you have to wait a bit longer for the extended edition or the appendices as opposed to the other one. As soon as I booted up those, not knowing what to expect, it was just like, wow. Absolute education, even to this day, and insight. But then comparing to The Hobbit, like you said, that's something that I had to like kind of it definitely broke my brain a little bit in terms of like, but this is the same people, this is the same creator, this is the same kind of visionary, same team, yet why is there a contrast? You nailed it on the head as to why a lot of the things are. And I guess to summarize, to simplify, it's just business, right? Like it's just the money side of things, because it wasn't supposed to be him, it's supposed to be Guillermo del Toro, I believe. And then because that didn't work out, I think he's mentioned it in the actual making of, is like, well, I can't use this concept. This is not my vision. So let's redo it all over again. And it's kind of like, yeah, it just, the approach was completely different as well. But also,
and also it was Peter Jackson after the Lord of the Rings. Like it's like George Lucas after Star Wars. Like who's gonna come up and be like, that's a terrible idea?
Exactly. Yeah, and even like if it wasn't that in and of itself, Peter Jackson at the time of Lord of the Rings, whether he felt like he had to prove something or not, he didn't have that. The name didn't have clout or weight that it does now. So I guess, and by the sounds of it, a lot of the battles that he had just to get Lord of the Rings made, switching studios or production companies or whatever, and all that kind of stuff, that filming it back to back wasn't a case of like a flex. That was a way to save money, I believe, or like to prove that we can get the story told, give us the budget, etc., etc. And the struggle and difficulty made the greatness. Just like with the prequel trilogies, his credit was to the max. He had unlimited credit, so he could say, "I want to do whatever I want." I believe they had like an insane amount of red cameras, unlimited resources essentially. And I guess that is a lesson learned. There's two names just mentioned there, George Lucas and Peter Jackson. Both had a similar arc in terms of resources and how they got this vision across, and different results. Yeah, that's just my rant.
I think one ancillary. No, this is one ancillary point to be made there. Like you mentioned the whole Guillermo del Toro thing, right? Which then means that Peter Jackson comes on and has like a lot less time. So like, yeah, budget at the wazoo, but there's still limits. But there's also the time thing, where he has to make 3 movies out of The Hobbit, which of course is a much smaller movie. And I think specifically he was a Lord of the Rings fan. Like he had read the Lord of the Rings a bajillion times. I don't think and I mean, like, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that part of the lore, that part of the world, like, meant that much to him. So when he has a clear vision about like what the Haradrim or what the Gondorians are supposed to look like, that's because he's lived that book. Right, but like, how do you design the people of Dale or the lake people? Right, like what kind of world design elements do you have with you? And unless you are one of those weirdos who sit on like LordofTheRings.net and like argue with other people on whether or not like the Gardariki of the Viking Age is a better allegory, and of course Tolkien hated allegories, but like it's a better parallel than say like the Viennese or the people of Amsterdam, like, because all of these are, you know, people living on essentially like man-made islands in the middle of like lakes, and yeah, like those discussions need to be had. But again, it's like it would have been the kind of argumentation that you need to have where you're arguing ideas, and I just don't think they had the time for it. That's why you end up with like some dwarf weapons that had like weird angles on them and stuff, because they were like, well, Gimli's stuff had like angles on them, so like clearly we just got to do like angles. And they're like, yeah, okay. No one's gonna argue with that. All right, Peter, let's go.
And just from your perspective and your own, I guess, like approach to these kind of problems as an artist, when you're faced with this kind of thing, you mentioned obviously a few things already, like about becoming not so like argumentative, and I guess that's an oversimplification of having the conversation, and also understanding, okay, there's a problem here. How do you have that conversation as to the better solution? And then, in a weird way, there becomes a different battle, not in the sense of trying to find the best design, but trying to find the best way to communicate that you should go to the route to get the best design, as opposed to just whatever's quicker. How do you navigate that?
So contextuality is kind of like my go-to umbrella term for like how to have that argument, right? You have to understand, you have to make a mutual understanding inside whatever the team is, of like, where does this world exist, right? Or is it a Mario world, or is it a Game of Thrones world? Is it a Final Fantasy world, or is it like, I don't know, like a Battlefield, whatever the hell world? You know, like, how do we relate to reality? To which degree is aesthetics the overriding consideration, and to which degree are we telling a world creation story here, right? So if you're doing Battlefield, for example, I mean, Battlefield is a fascinating franchise to sort of look at, because it's such a fine balance in like what we would call realism, and like how their audience related to it. You know, like the audience of Battlefield want a very certain feeling. They want a feeling of, I'm not in a Call of Duty game, right? I'm not the guy. I'm just some guy. But I am some guy with very, very special and cool weapons and all the tactical gear at the wazoo. But I want to be like just some soldier. I don't want to be like a special operator or anything, right? This is kind of the lesson that was learned in the last couple of games, and what seems to be sort of corrected for in this new Battlefield 6 that's coming out. And like, that's great, right? That's a very specific feeling. So if you can find what the sort of overriding consideration is, right? Like, you're some guy on a battlefield, and then we just go into actual real battlefield tech, like real world stuff, and we look at like what the cool stuff is, like what what gun aesthetics actually look like, and we try and like, you know, peel away this consideration because that's Call of Duty, and this consideration because it's like Fortnite or whatever, and we just try and look at the stuff that like actual gun nuts like, and you try and sort of look at like what that aesthetic world looks like, right? That's the Battlefield thing, for example. If you're designing for like Final Fantasy, you don't really care about bullet ballistics because you have gun blades or you have all kinds of weird shit, right? So then, if you're designing for Final Fantasy, I mean, it's different from like between games, right? Like if you're designing for Final Fantasy 7 and 9, for example, those are two very different worlds. So again, like each of those worlds, though, at least in the very good Final Fantasies, it's very much about them understanding the internal dynamics of the world that they've created. And I think like that's very much how you got to start any. I mean, as I said, like I work quite a bit in pre-production. That's the challenge in every pre-production is we got to sit down and pretty early, like make up some principles so that we can have discussions. Because if we can't have discussions, if someone just comes in like, this is really cool, and then that becomes an acceptable argument, then suddenly we are on very thin ice. Because then suddenly it's about individual considerations of aesthetics. Mm-hmm. And I'm nothing against that, but that needs to be contextualized. It needs to be constrained by a set of rules so that we can make it work. And by that, I mean, like, if you're making a game that has an interactive game world, for example, like The Witcher is a great example of this. The Witcher has an interactive game world. So the game is literally telling you, like, you're existing in this world. So whatever the rules you're observing as a player of this game has an effect, right? It doesn't actually have to have an effect in terms of game, but your ability to interact with this game, this world in an immersive way is about the game telling you that this world is real and you by your actions can have an effect. And so when you walk into, say, like, when you're just walking around in the world, it's super impressive because it has like weather systems and like things change and there's wildlife and like it's really sort of quite immersive. The cities, though, are a problem for The Witcher 3 specifically. I haven't played the new one, but The Witcher 3 is problematic because it's so well done. They made it so pretty. They made it so nice. They made it, I mean, aesthetics-wise, it's really sort of adapted to that world. However, they did too good of a job. So it all looks like you're supposed to be able to go and interact with it. And the moment you can't, the moment everything that you can do is like this guy over here, or this guy over here, or this guy over here, and then everything else is just like blocked off. It's unimmersive. It takes you out of the action rather than putting you into the action. And like a game like Dragon's Dogma 2, the new one, they actually like corrected on this. So they just like allow you to walk into everywhere, which is also like, it's weird, but at least you can do it. So then it becomes up to you to role play, you know, authentically. So lots of different ways of approaching that. But the point being that when you're designing a world, you have to then like take into consideration what's the experience you're trying to give the audience. And in The Witcher, you are literally like a noir detective. So the idea of being like Disney worlded around a very beautifully designed world is really immersion breaking because you're supposed to feel like that guy who's good at like ruminating and sniffing things out. And when it's that obvious, whatever you're supposed to go to, you're kind of just going from point to point. Mm-hmm. You don't feel like a detective. You feel like a guy. You feel like a fighting character, right? But that's not what a Witcher is supposed to be. So it's very mercurial. It's very sort of weird, but it's really, really important to not waste time early on in production. So like having those discussions, you can save you so much heartache by simply saying like, this is this and this is that. And these are the principles by which we are defining what the experience we want for our audience, right? And so just to sort of full end it with The Witcher. And again, like The Witcher is a great group of people that designed it, and it's a good game. But they did such a good job in the early games of making like the you are a noir detective in a fantasy world thing. And so in the later games, they kind of like realized that like a lot of people just kind of want a fighty experience. They want to be the guy who goes around and beating people up. Mm-hmm. It's kind of GTA more than it's LA Noire, you know? And it's like, that's fine, but it's also, it sort of removes from the specialness of that world. So it's a bit sort of back and forth. But, you know, that's down to game studios as well.
Fascinating. For people that are listening who are in a similar boat, wherever they're working at the moment, or maybe even like a uni still or whatever they're doing, they see this, or they feel like this isn't right, or something's not right here, no matter how many sketches they do or iterations, there's just something not clicking, and it's pretty much what you just said. It's that either the conversation hasn't happened, or the direction, or the way they're trying to tackle it. Things haven't been resolved early on enough.
Yep.
For those people that are listening, especially those who, well, I guess for any level, what would you say is the best way to have those conversations and approach them? Because a lot of people will just not have that conversation because either they feel they're not qualified to, or they don't want to cause a conflict that can jeopardize basically their livelihood. So what would you advise to them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, actually. I mean, it depends, right? If you're working with people that are so vengeful that they might fire you for a conversation, like you might want to consider like looking for other jobs. So I know the market is a bit fucky right now, but if you should be in the context where they're at least allowant, then take whoever is the person who is usually in charge of the word in the meeting, right? Be that your creative director or your art director or whoever. Sit them down and just say like, okay, I have these considerations, right? Like we're spending a lot of time doing iteration, which means I'm chasing something, but I don't know what I'm chasing because it's not been cleared up. And if we defined that and we could have like a back and forth conversation, I could probably do a better job for you, right? If you present it in the way where like you're doing, I mean, because you're doing a service, right? You're doing a service for people. And I think a lot of the problems we have in production is poor communication of contextuality, right? Like it's everything. I mean, we have art directors, for God's sake. It's the studio setups in general are terrible. They're awful. Like I do not envy anyone who is an art director because it's awful. But it's also because they are middlemen too, right? They're caught between producers and the people who give them cool drawings. And then they have to sit there and be like, no, that leg's wrong or whatever. Right. And that's shit too. But I think it's shit because it's part of like a bad setup. And I think it would be pretty easily remedied, by contextual conversations. Like having a horizontal work group where everyone's like voice counts the same, and you can have like like a rotating leadership where you have someone who's like a creative director or something, but that could be better. Back to like an actual example of something someone can do given the circumstances that are now. Taking the person who is in charge aside and say like, hey, I'd like to do a better job for you. So here is my suggestion, right? Can we have a conversation where you can explain to me what the rules we're playing by are? Because by knowing the rules and understanding the considerations that you put in when you say this works, this doesn't work, and if you can verbalize that to me in a way that isn't jargon being like specific, very mercurial terms that are hard to identify. If we can avoid those kinds of words so that I can get a definition, then I promise I will try and follow those rules. And in return, you'll allow me to like argue my concept, right? So that way you're not focusing on delivering the prettiest sketch you can. You're not focusing on brainless rendering. You're taking that time and you're putting it into like a better idea, So, and I think that's what, again, like that's what concept art should be, I think, because it doesn't matter how pretty your drawing is. It doesn't matter how many details it has. If it's when translated through some brilliant 3D designer comes into a game and it looks, for lack of a better term, not great, then it's not doing its job. Like there's lots of beautiful drawings that turn into terrible assets in video games because no one really thought about the context in which they're supposed to exist. One game that I worked on and that has been out for a while, and I think I'm safe to talk about it. I don't think we're going to get in trouble for this, but Assassin's Creed Valhalla was a game that I worked on and got to make some assets for, and there was some cool stuff in that game, and there were some terrible things in that game, according to me. And I think the bad stuff came when the conversations stopped, right? Like during pre-productions, we had quite a bit of conversations. I worked freelance for them, through some wonderful people, and it was great because we could talk about like what they wanted the game experience to be. And then during the production cycle, they got bought by, or they got like external influences or something. So things changed. But the point was that production went very seamlessly because we could free flow ideas pretty effectively back and forth. And so we did like a lot of work in like 6 months, and then the next 6 months we did a lot less work because there was a lot of iteration and a lot of frustration because some person got placed into effectively like a sort of board art director role where their ideas was what counted. And that makes me sound like, oh, their ideas were bad and my ideas are good. It's not really about that. It's just about like, if they could have explained their ideas to me and why those ideas were good, how they fit better into the context of this game, I think I might have liked it. But there was no context. There was no concept for the game. It was just vaguely Viking-y Assassin's Creed. And then that's what they got. And I think that's a bit of the downfall of that game, to be fair. But sort of in general, yeah, like have that straight conversation of just saying, like, I'd like to do a good job. I need to understand what I'm supposed to be doing, because right now it's a bit vague. And as the art director, like, either you are vaguely guiding according to like general principles of the job, or you know exactly what's going on. And in both cases, like, we could work better together if we have that conversation and we sort of keep that conversation going. I think that also has the potential of cutting down a lot of frustration, which then opens up new forms of communication.
And would you say that's just simply all boils down to, or the most powerful tool in that situation is just having a conversation and just communication?
Yeah, like the thing I usually do before I even start drawing with the client is to insist on a call, kind of like what we're having right now, where I just want them to like tell me the story. Like, I felt terribly vindicated the other day because I watched an interview with Hans Zimmer, the composer, right? And he said said it beautifully, and it's way better than I ever could. But he said that his job wasn't to give the director the song or the music the director wanted. His job was to listen to the director's story and then give him the music that the director could never have imagined in the first place, right? And I'm like, preach. And that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. That's the point of concept design, is that we're in the same way that Hans Zimmer is a giant music nerd, like he's a nerd of music. We're supposed to be that of design, of whatever the niche design that you get hired to do, right? For me, it's usually fantasy stuff, like pretty broadly, like fantasy stuff. And I know I don't like to flatter myself, but I know a lot of history and I know a lot of like fantasy stuff. And also, like, I know a lot of the fantasy stuff I don't like, and so I have like pretty specific ideas about what I think a good fantasy thing is. And so my job isn't to, if I get like if I get told like, oh, make us a knight, I'm gonna be like, okay, tell me about it. Like, give me context, give me contextual information so that I can make choices in the design where you can recognize choices that you've made in choices that I make, so that we make multiple layered designs. So when we present this to an audience, just harkening back to what we talked about earlier, it comes off as confident. If it comes off as confident, then the audience will be immersed. Their disbelief will be suspended, and they will live into it. And it won't be for purely aesthetic reasons. It will be because we presented them ideas that harmonize and that echo in each other, so that once they explore the world more, they'll see and make sense of like that choice over that choice and that choice in place of that choice. And the world will become more real, and they'll start trying, they will become part of the suspension of disbelief rather than going against it. And just as a side note on like the suspension of disbelief, did you watch The Irishman?
I have, yes.
Yes. So The Irishman is like a great example of essentially like Shakespearean suspension of disbelief, right? Because the movie is amazing, but the youthification like technology is kind of like it's flawlessly flawed, if you know what I mean. Like, you can never really point out like specifically what it is, but it's like what you're doing is just looking for the flaws. You're not enjoying their artistry and their acting. You're just kind of going like, is that fucked up? I think that's fucked up. Or just when De Niro moves and you're like, those are the movements of an 80-year-old man. Like, what the hell? You know?
Yes.
And so like they spent all of that money to get their audience to be immersed, but all the audience is doing is like effectively de-immersing themselves because they're not really enjoying the movie. They're not sitting there. I mean, it's a good movie, so you're not bothered by it, but it's just your attention isn't on the psychological framing of this like quite fascinating character who's doing this like essentially like, you know, slowly but surely falling into the immorality of being a hired gun. You are constantly just looking for where the youthification of Robert De Niro fucks up, and you're like, that was my experience of that movie. And so in terms of like fantasy, it sort of works the same way. The moment you put armor and a sword and stuff on screen, there's a large part of your audience that are kind of just, they're looking for the edges. They're looking for wherever the immersion is going to break. And so the more you're willing and able to put a floor and a ceiling on that box and say like, here's our definition. Here's how we've defined the believability of what we're going to make for you. They're no longer going to be looking, because they're going to be like, yeah, sure. Which is, again, like, just as a parallel to The Irishman, the reason why, like, older movies where they just had kind of shitty makeup and to make people young or old, like, that works because we're just like, oh, that's where the edge is. Now I know. Now I can enjoy the artistry, right? So, again, like, the reason why Mario, for example, is incredibly immersive is because that box, those definitions are so clear. They're like, logically, there are no limits. We could do anything. So you'll be surprised, but our verisimilitude, our bothering to try and fool you, stops here. This is our floor. This is our ceiling. Beyond that, we're not going to fuck with you. Like you'll know what's going on, and that I think is great.
Excellent. That's so articulated, and 1,000,000,000% agree. Especially just a Hans Zimmer shout out. I believe I've seen that particular interview, and there's a few others. I had not expected to hear his approach that were anticipated. I expected to hear like, you know, high level music theory and, you know, these level chords do this, etc., etc. But he just speaks, like you just said, like it's literal conversation. There's one where he's speaking about, I went in there thinking I wanted to hear more about The Dark Knight and Inception. Yet it was what he's talking about, Jack Sparrow's theme and Pirates of the Caribbean was the most fascinating thing, where he was just basically not saying the C note and this, etc. Like this, does this mean is mischievous, or basically just giving everything a personality, his personifying all these different things. And it was just like, of course. And then it just simplifies that genius even more, because yes, of course, there's a lot of things going on in his mind and how he communicates, because he has a vast team and etc. His knowledge of tools, but his ability to understand not only what a story is, but also, like you just explained, how to find out the missing pieces that he needs to do his thing. And obviously, he's very experienced. He knows what to do. You're very experienced as well. When did you start to think about these kind of things? And when did you realize that knowing context and having conversations is maybe not what was missing, but something that you needed to have to do your thing?
That's a good question. I think I had this sort of layers to that. When I started out, it was I didn't really care about any of that stuff. I wanted to make cool drawings. And like my big inspirations were like, you know, Kim Young-gi and like Paul Dainton and Paul Bonner and like you know, these guys who were just like, they were really neat at drawing. Like I really liked that they could draw in ways that made my brain go like, ooh, that's cool. Like Paul Dainton kind of fucks me up all the time, because I don't know if you know who he is, but he's one of the big guys that like, or he used to be one of the big guys at Games Workshop. And like when you've seen his work, like it'll stick with you. But he is able to take, you know, this rather silly world of, actually this comes back to Care. I never thought about that before, but he's able to take the rather silly world of Warhammer and treats it, and Warhammer 40,000, and just treats it with absolute belief. Like his drawings are classically his drawing skills comes from like classical education. He's sort of incredibly good at like value work, and it all sort of feels like it's coming from like a Renaissance master almost. Like it's there. I think he had his education at the London School of Fine Arts. Like he's there. And so he takes a Space Marine, like a big bulky fucking rounded shoulder Space Marines, you know, like they look very silly. And he just makes, I mean, they look badass, but they look silly. And he makes them not just look cool, but he makes them look like completely believable on a sort of almost realistic level. Like the guns are still outsized and the heads are small and whatever, but you still like completely believe the composition. You completely believe the setting. And he sets it next to like, you know, like an Imperial Guardsman who's just a human with like some stuff on. And again, like the way that it's all rendered out, the way that it's painted, the way that it's presented, he has cared enough to make these stipulations. He's cared enough to think like, all right, how do I make that work? How do I make this work? How do I explain this in a way where the audience will just kind of accept that this is like this kind of material, and then we can move on, you know? And it's even more impressive with something like, you know, the Tyranids or something, or like the orcs and the goblins in Warhammer. And so like, definitely like started with that, where I was fascinated with the ability of taking something that the face of is somewhat silly and just presenting it in a way where you bypass the disbelief part of the brain and just kind of get the audience with you. Because once you're there, then you too, as an audience member, can start taking that world seriously, and you're immersed, you're in it. And so like Paul Dainton does it with like artistry and elegance. I think Paul Bonner, another favorite of mine, he does it with, you know, more rule of cool, but a very specific and weird rule of cool, where it's not about being pretty, it's just about being strange. And like, that's fun. Like it's so much fun to look at his drawings, because you see that he cares. He gives such a shit. Like he gives so much of a shit. And I think, you know, once I discovered, good old, Kim Yoon-gi, I mean, the king of care, you know, like there's nothing he didn't care about. So like everything could be cool. And once you realize that everything can be cool, then it's not really about like making it pretty to make it cool. It's about making it understood. It's like when he drew a motorcycle, he didn't necessarily draw the coolest motorcycle, but he drew the motorcycle the coolest way, right? So, and that wasn't like the flashiest way or whatever. It was just like he knew what a motorcycle looked like. And not just like from one angle or two angles, but like from every angle. And so I think that's sort of where it started in many ways. But you could also make the argument that it started way earlier than that. It sort of goes back to like kindergarten, because like my kindergarten teacher, later in life, she wrote a PhD on children learning through play. And I'm one of her subjects from my kindergarten days. And it's mostly just about like how children take play as like cues for life, you know. And I would play very seriously. I've always been quite serious about play, less so about the rest of life, but like play is very important to me, because like that's where you get to live life, you know. So like I would go to live action role playing games, and I used to do medieval reenactment, and like all of this stuff where again it's like suspension of disbelief like is key. You have to care enough to present like this vision of an idea, so that other people don't have to ask questions. They just get the information intuitive. And so like, I think once I started like doing, design as a job, you sort of just intuitively start applying those kinds of ideas to that process, you know? Like what I want is to take ideas that I find really interesting, but I have a hard time like verbalizing to other people. Like I could set you down and I could start explaining to you why the evolution of sword design, or the evolution of swords from like the beginning of the Iron Age, or from the end of the Bronze Age, up through like, you know, the modern period, is fascinating. And then I could talk about, you know, like the introduction of infrastructure and how the different kind of tempering techniques and the localization of information and like the transference of information through generations, like all that stuff is super fascinating. But most of the audience is going to be asleep by paragraph 3. You know, so then I can't be talking about this stuff, because that's going to put people to sleep. So you got to do it in other ways, right? And so you can do that through things like world building. So instead of like talking about it, you just show them. So it's show, don't tell. You know, once you learn that principle, then everything is show, don't tell. But it's about knowing what to tell, or knowing what you're trying to show, and it should be worth telling in the first place. And then you start reading philosophy, and suddenly you're on like, is it Aristotle? Who says, you know, the fool speaks because he must say something. The wise man speaks because he has something to say. So this thing of like, do you have something to say, or are you just trying to make some noise? And like, I've made a lot of noise. It's not everything that I've said that it needs saying, you know, but like, I like the idea of if you have something to say, you should try and have the skill set to say it. So I've completely forgotten what the original question was, but at least the rant went on for a while. So
No, it answered it for me. Like basically, just like where did it come from? Like in terms of needing to have the conversation, and like you said, literally from the very beginning, and learning through play. Like that's something that, as a parent, like I've seen two children, very different approaches. One likes needs to learn through play, and the other one, play is the way not to learn. It's almost like that's just the way to kind of let off steam, for example. And it's just fascinating to see the two approaches and the way, I guess, like, the development path or the skill tree path the brain wants to take to reach basically survival, whatever human process or meaning of life is supposed to be. It's absolutely fascinating. But yeah, like doing that into a design context, it definitely shows why, at least to me, why that's important to you, because it clearly is important to yourself, like the conversations and the context, and just basically getting the answers you need to work your magic. Now, two questions. One's going to be, I guess, the more positive one, but I'm going to start with the negative one first. When you're in that situation where you've tried to have the conversations and you've tried to get all the answers you need, but you're not getting them, you still got a job to do. How are you able, A, to do the job? Because obviously it's going to be frustrating. And do your frustrations get the better of you at times, or are you able to tame them? And equally, how do you at least come to a resolution in that situation?
So, that's again great questions. So I'm gonna talk then for a second about this guy who taught me to deal with that, which again like takes us back to like the first year of Volta, where like the Canadian company I started working at, where, because the short answer is like, okay, you did your best, you tried, and it didn't work. They didn't listen. They want to go with a path that you don't agree with. All right, tough titties, Turkleton. Like, you got a job to do. You better find a way to enjoy it the best you can. And you're gonna be annoyed with it, but at least just fucking laugh at it. It's fine. It's not the end of the world. That's the short answer. The long answer is Arno Fö's School of Hard Knocks. So Arno Fö was my first art lead at Volta, and he's a wonderful guy. He's sort of the height of positivity in a non-toxic way. So he was never like, don't care about it, just do it. He said like, well, we can learn things, right? We essentially, my first couple of weeks at Volta, they had made some moves and decisions that had made it so that we had to do back panels for like online slot games, which isn't like the dream job you're kind of thinking about when you got a job at like an outsourcing company. You're like, what the fuck? And so I come there, I'm a bit crestfallen, honestly, because I thought I was going to come in and do like character concepts and like learn lots of cool stuff, and then we had to do that. And so he took me aside and he was like, hey, I see you. Like, I get it. This isn't the coolest, and we won't be doing this for long, and like there will be an end to it. But let's make a point of it. Let's try and learn some stuff instead, And there was we can, and I was like, oh, what the fuck do you mean? Like, what are we gonna learn from doing fucking like backboards for slot games? Like, this is nonsense. And it's like, well, we can do texture exercises. I'm like, fucking texture? What are you talking about? And yeah, he was completely right. There are different materials that we had to paint, right? There was metal, and there was like foliage, and there was like different stuff. And he had pointed out that, like, in a lot of your paintings, Evan, a lot of the materials look kind of samey. It's not like plasticky, sort of over-rendered Photoshop thing. So let's work on that. We're going to take the next 4 weeks, and that's going to be our goal. And if we do a good job and you see improvement in that, we're going to feel good about it. It's like, that is a great way of like dealing with it. Because we were not going to end up like feeling good about those pictures. They were not cool pictures. Like, we're not going to post that to our DeviantArts or whatever. We're not going to post that to our ArtStation. We were going to leave that alone. But if we felt better about like how we painted stuff, all right, cool. All right. So that's what you do, I think, is you find whatever there is that is beneficial in the thing that you're going to have to do, and you focus on that. I think, in terms of work, you need to sort of bifurcate your brain, right? You have to have a professional mindset and your personal artistic mindset. And in your personal artistic mindset, you're chasing whatever demon you're chasing. Like, that is great. This is exactly what you got to do, because that is what makes you. And that is important, right? Like, it might not always seem important, but it is. It's the thing that's going to make you. And I know that sounds like trite and everything, but like, one day or maybe already, people are going to be like, oh, that's the thing that is you. And you're going to be like, is it? And they're like, yeah. And you're like, oh, cool. I guess that's the thing I've been chasing. Because that's what it is to other people. That's fun. That's a whole conversation about like style and stuff. But in the professional mindset, you're doing a job, and that's not always going to be the funnest. Sometimes it's going to suck a little, and you can quit. You know, it's one of the benefits of the modern age. But if you don't want it, if you want to stick with it, and you're willing to kind of take those deep breaths and go for long coffee breaks and you know, like go through the suck a bit, then do that, and try and find ways of like sneaking the best out of it. And if that isn't texture things, then it can be you're taking the time to work on your line game, or you're taking the time to like make sure you're color harmonizing well. Or maybe it's something as simple as like if you're working in Photoshop, you can set up actions. Like one of the and we had another one where I learned to do actions in Photoshop, which is like a whole sub bracket. And essentially it's programming, right? It's just teaching you how to tell Photoshop to do like a sequence of things for you. And like I've never been the kind of person who can do that. That is like I would rather just go and do all of those steps myself, because setting up the action just seems like such a chore. And it's just like it's when it breaks, I want to cry, and it's all that kind of stuff. Like it's in a different it's a non-overlapping magisteria with where I'm at. But it was either that, or it was to like actually do those things on things where I didn't care about those things. And that sucks more. So you're like, hey, I'm going to learn to do actions then. So pragmatism, I guess. Read some Marcus Aurelius and just be like, no, I'm gonna be a stoic on this one. You know, the slings and arrows of an unjust world. Sometimes you got to take it.
Oh, very wise. Now on the flip side, what kind of projects, and you can even do some name drops as well, where it's completely connected and you've gotten what you need and it's just bliss? How does that look? And if you can name drop, which kind of projects were those?
I can talk sort of abstractly about a project that I'm on now, which is for a company called Artifacts Mundi. They're a Polish company. The game is not out yet, so I can't really talk like in detail, but it's been one of the most sort of instructive, but also like vindicating projects I've ever been on. And essentially, it was like they'd already built essentially like their game, but they wanted to, like the game world to have a certain flair that they hadn't achieved. And so like we started a conversation, and they're essentially saying, you know, like we have a feeling, we have an idea that we don't think we've achieved yet, and we would like your take on what we have and like how we could move towards that. And I perk up at that email because I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. Like that's a fun way of getting to like test all my theories. Ooh, fun. And so, you know, I try then to like, you know, practice what I preach. So we have long conversations. I get them to talk about like, you know, what were their own, like from a gameplay perspective, how do they want the audience to feel? And from a world building perspective, like what are they inspired by and what's important to them, and so on and so forth. And little by little, we start sort of chipping away at it. And it's been like 2 years now, still working on it. And like, it's fun. It's fabulous. It's not everything. And I think like, it's a good example of, it's the best project I've ever worked on. And it's, of course, like, it's not, you know, if it had been all my choices, it would have been different than what it is. But I'm very happy with what it is, because it's fun to work with other people who have very specific ideas about what they want too. And I can 100% dig on some of what their ideas are, even if it's not my ideas. I'm like, oh, that kind of works. That works in the way that you want it, and that's what they want. So I'm like, I'm so happy to do that, you know. So that it's a fascinating thing to learn that like the principle is more important to me than the actual outcome. Mm-hmm. It does not matter to me exactly how the asset comes out. We're doing a lot of like fantasy stuff. I can't speak again, but so like, you know, there's your classic fantasy menagerie of races and creatures and whatnot, but with some interesting spins. And it's fun to sort of get to take your ideas of things and throw them at them, and they're like, oh yeah, maybe this, but with that, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, we could do that. That gives us an interesting thing that definitely isn't like the thing I would come up with. But then again, this is my world, so I have to play in someone else's sandbox, and that's fun too. So so there's that. Like that's probably the most fun I've ever had in a professional context. But since we have two mindsets, there is then also like my own personal project that I fuck around with called Tine, and that's the most fun that I've ever had with anything. But it's a different kind of fun, you know. Like sometimes because I'm trying like to write a story, and I'm not a good writer, and so like I have to learn how to write at least decently. And this is like wonderful guy from the US is like he's teaching me, and I'm teaching him some drawing stuff, and it's both interesting and like mortifying to go through the process again of being like terrible at like a creative expression.
Interesting.
So there's that part of it, and there's like that drawing that world, because that world, that's very weird, right? Like I never really understood what Tolkien meant about like a second world until I started doing this, because it started like almost 10 years ago now. In 2016, I sat down and like did like a drawing a day, and a bunch of those drawings started like binding together, like they just kind of fit together. And so like that started like creating this like context in my head of like, oh, this could be like that kind of world, and this could like fit in there. And what do I want in a fantasy world? I definitely don't want these things. I want to like do that thing or whatever, right? And so like fantasy, for example, has become its own kind of set of jargons and cliches. A lot, you know, like there's a lot of like Dungeons and Dragons, like things we take for granted. Warlocks are this things, and wizards are that thing, or whatever. And I'm not a fan of that. Like I love me some D&D, but like you can miss me with all of that nonsense. Like fantasy to me is the fantastical, and category is the opposite of the fantastical to me. So you can miss me with all of that nonsense. So I figure like fantasy is well placed in places where we have a minimal, or at least like a shortage of historical fuel, right? So we have to make shit up, right? And that's great. So the High Middle Ages, at this point, there's so many people who are fascinated by the High Middle Ages. We know so much about it now. It's not a great place for fantasy anymore, I think. The Renaissance, or like wherever the rapier comes into the picture, like even less so, because we're getting so close to a place where we have so much archaeological knowledge that, yeah, the sort of playing field is too populated, and I'm like, I want to go the other way. So you can go back to like the classical ages, right? And so what's fun to do with the classical ages? Well, we know way too much about Rome, for example. So we cut Rome out of the picture. What's the stuff we don't know? Okay, we don't know about like the Gauls. We know some about the Greeks, but there's like a surprising little amount we know about like the sociological elements of the Greeks. Okay, we can do this and that. So the whole Tine thing became like this way of taking my sort of interest in history and all of the little fiddly bits of history, and sort of say, okay, if I take that and I take this and I sort of put them together and put them over here, and I take these things over here, and I start playing out like these kinds of movements, like what does that look like? What's that? Is that fun? Oh, that's pretty fun. What happened with this guy over here? And you sort of just like start. I don't know if you've ever played with like, you know, miniature soldiers or like, you know, little electric trains and stuff. Yeah. It's exactly like that. And you just start stuff and you just see what happens. And like whatever's fascinating to you, you're like, zoom in a little bit more. Say that again. Okay. Oh, okay. Say that again. Oh, what about, oh, okay. And then you just fuck around with it and you try and do something. So I have no idea if it's going to be any good, but I'm having a lot of fun with it as I'm going along. So that's like the other way of doing it, you know?
Oh,
it's the same kind of category statement, because it's still, everything's being built from the sort of big into small and details out and stuff. But it's just it's not structured along any line of needing to be a sort of effective production. It's just me throwing things and building things and going and having as much fun as I can along the way.
That helped me set my segue up perfectly. That's what the next thing we're going to talk about. So that literally just began with you throwing those sketches out, or was it always kind of swimming in your head way before that?
Lots of different stuff. Like essentially, like there was definitely like, if we use swimming as the metaphor, then it was definitely like a good sized puddle of stuff just floating around, like fascinating ideas that I'd had, or like things that I wanted an excuse to go study. You know, like the Persian empires are very interesting because they're all so different from each other, but they sort of share a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of like interesting weird bits with like meta history when it comes to like a lot of Eastern cultures, but especially the Persians, because they've sort of been as a polity been sort of wiped out a bunch of times by different conquerors, but the culture stayed. So there's like there's a lot of like interesting stuff about that. So like the sort of the image of like layers and layers of culture slowly being assimilated into the Ur culture kind of thing, which I find really fascinating. So like there was that, for example, and that became one part of the Tine universe. But then I had to like justify it, because nothing like that just happens. So like, why do those things happen? Do they happen, or is it just something I'm seeing when I'm reading history? All right, I'm gonna say that it happens, and I'm gonna find like a reason for it to be happening because it's a cool idea. It was stuff like that. So I have this whole like idea, for example, about like we don't really know much about the Gauls and the Celts because they never wrote anything down before they were Romanized, right? So, and by the time they were Romanized, they were educated in the Greco-Roman style. So they never really knew how to write down anything about their own thing. But we know a bunch of stuff about them because archaeology. But we don't really have a context in which to put it. We can't really say what the human part of it was because they're no longer alive to tell us. So what can we do? Well, we can look at where Celts went and lived with other people that wrote, right? So we have the Galician kingdom in what today is Turkey, where a bunch of Gallic Celts sort of fought their way through Greece and just kind of conquered a bunch of areas. And they were like, well, I guess we live here now. And then some of them went like raiding and sort of mercenary working down in Egypt and stuff. It's a whole story. Wild shit, by the way. Like there's so much other stuff than Rome in the classical period, and people just kind of roam out. The whole thing about like how often do you think of the Roman Empire? I'm annoyed at the Roman Empire. Like I could care less about the Roman Empire. Give me all of the other stuff. Like there's so many people who care about the Roman Empire. I care about the Roman Empire too, obviously. Like there's a lot of cool stuff with them. But like we know so much about that. So all of the other stuff is what I want to nerd out about. So, for example, in the Tine setting, we do have sort of allegorical kingdoms and areas that are inspired by and sort of live in the sphere of influence of the Celto-Gallic, but they're not. Where we don't have anything, I have to sort of splice in other things. So they have like polities based loosely on like the northern Greeks, and with experimenting with like democracies and all this, like that kind of thing. And we have different kinds of religions that schism and go into the like civil wars. And we have cultures being driven mad by like this interaction or that interaction, sort of simulating things that you read in history. And you kind of go, I see that it happens, but I have no idea how that happens. So now I have to figure out how I could argue it. So it comes back to like, you have an idea. Now you want to present it. Now you want to like make it work, So there's, and then sometimes it's just like charming things. Like, I don't know if you ever hung out with joggers, for example, like people who jog. I jog a lot, but like there's a very specific subset. There's people who jog, like I jog. I'm not a jogger. There are people who are joggers, like, and they are like, they're always like the nicest. Like, it's not that they're the nicest people, but the most upbeat people. They're always up here, and they, and it's the fun. So like, I have a whole culture of people called the Marchers who are essentially that. Like, they are barbarians, but they're also joggers, so they're like always on the move and always like, and it's just because it's built around like a lot of people I grew up with who are like that, like sports people who go like skiing and stuff. And it's just like, it's fun to take those kinds of things and then like, again, starts like putting things up and like blowing them down and seeing what happens, So yeah, like it just started with a bunch of sketches that sort of allowed me to start putting together a framework or like a context. Nice. And then I could take other ideas and start dropping it in and seeing like what worked and what didn't.
Nice. So all this time, because I've never heard it pronounced, I've been calling it Tegan all this time. So it's the G silent. It's Tine. Is that close?
Yeah, Tine.
Okay. Yeah. What state is it in right now? Because I know you got like a few books of it now. Like, and I also really like the fact that what you just said, like there's no specific, I guess, end goal maybe where it's going to be. Like it's just going to, I guess, flourish and grow as it needs to grow. But yeah, what kind of form and what kind of state is it in right now?
So right now, I'm writing a book about like the course of events around like one character. His name is Harl, and he's a young kid. But I don't really, again, like this is part of my problem with a lot of fantasy, is that fantasy tends to be sort of reminiscent of history in that it is sort of great man history, right? It's about Alexander the Great, or it's about Julius Caesar, or whatever. Harl is not special. Harl is just some kid. And like, he is not going to be the fulcrum around which the world turns. But the world is going to be turning, and he's going to be around to like look at some of the stuff and like have his own little story happening as shit happens around him. So it's kind of like, I don't know if you ever like the Flashman Chronicles or anything of that nature, where it's like you have an interesting character who's doing like really weird stuff and like getting into scrapes and stuff, but he's not changing the world, but the world is changing, that kind of thing. So Harl is existing in a world that has, you know, like a lot of stuff going on. And he's going to have a quite cool adventure, but there's going to be way bigger things happening. So it's an attempt at doing, like, I guess, anti-fantasy, where like it is a power fantasy in as much as it's a person who gets to go on a cool adventure, but it's also not the guy who like becomes the strongest wizard or the biggest hero.
Right.
He's just a kid. And he's fucking around, and also he's very silly. Like, he's a dumb kid, kind of like what I was. So it's that thing of his superpower is being slightly dim,
Okay.
not like stupid, but maybe a little stupid. But mostly like, if you're gonna be dumb, you got to be tough. Kind of hero description, I guess. But yeah, like he's got a bit of a fantastical mind, for example, which makes him like catnip to small gods, because they find that like he'll believe them if they say stuff.
Sick.
So they can fool him into like going on quests and stuff. So it's that kind of thing.
Awesome. Is it going to mainly be centered around him, or this particular book?
No, so yeah, I mean, it's starting with him, and then there's a bunch of other characters. So it starts in a place called the Heideholt, which is like their home, sort of like his father figure. It's not his. Anyway, his name is Orlauf, and he's a local jarl, and so like he's one of the characters that we get in POE from, and his mother, Hertha, we get a POE for. But then we also get a POE for this other guy called Rogsarni, who's from this like great empire. He's like a bit of a like surveyor kind of dude, but he's also an asshole. So like things happen to him. And there's a bunch of other characters we're gonna sort of run by. But the story is more about like, the story itself is mostly about like the world and how it's changing. And then we just kind of follow Harold mostly and these other characters as they sort of like just work their way through it. But they're quite fun characters. Most of them, at least. Some of them are not.
Sounds super like intriguing already. Tolkien famously took 2 decades just to build the lore before he wrote Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Which actually sounds like heaven to me. Like, just you have that much time to just flesh things out, and then I'm ready now and go ahead. That's almost like setting your own deadline, so to speak, and the deadline is fluid and just pops up when it's ready. What is your relationship with this? Are you happy for it to take time? Do you have kind of some inner kind of like personal targets you want to reach, or urgency with this?
No, I kind of take like the childish Gambino approach to it. Like, I just want to make something cool. I want to make cool stuff. So I'm not in a particular hurry. I've never been particularly like ambitious anyway. So if I wanna have something fun to work on. So I'm working on this. And then we'll just see what happens. Like, it's gonna become something, hopefully. But and you know, in the words of Dave Chappelle, I'd rather have it to become as I said, like I'd rather have it become something awesome than a cautionary tale. But you never know. So now the hope that I've been sort of, I started writing, and then my friend Max from the US, sort of, he's a professional writer. And so he looked at it and he was like, well, I see there's like a core to this, but you got to learn how to write. And so I was like, all right, fine. So that was like 2 years. And so I only really started like taking the writing of it seriously, maybe like 3 years ago. And so we're like 8.5 chapters into the first book. And I do like a Twitch stream once a week where I sit and like illustrate stuff. So we started illustrating stuff from like the lead-in chapter, the prologue, where you get a bit of a taste of what the kind of world is, because the whole prologue, just spoiler alert, but the whole prologue is sort of building itself around this like warrior hero guy. And at the end, it's not going to end well for him. So he's definitely not going to be a character further on in the story. Well, he will, in sort of like his shade will be there. But the whole point, the whole point of it being that like that's not the kind of character we're going for here. We're going for different kinds of characters.
So writing in particular, obviously, it's its own craft. Clearly, it's something that human civilization has just relied on for eons. How have you found that particular journey? Because obviously Max mentioned that you need to write. Sometimes as artists, we don't want to do the things that we kind of need to do. We'll just happily kind of like draw our way around particular things. How has that journey been for you?
Painful. Turns out writing is really hard. And it's but it's also like it's very paralleled to drawing or to painting. So I think I'd like to think that it's making me a better artist by it's allowing me to sort of new ways to think about the creative process. There's a lot of jargon terms I cringe at. The creative process is one of them. But that thing of like being cognizant about what you're trying to say and how you're trying to do things, I think is something that it's both very interesting, and it also makes me much more of a sort of appreciative reader, that you start sort of having a more, I think on the one hand, I'm becoming a more demanding reader. Like I feel like I can actually sort of look at a piece of writing and say more than just like, I don't like it, and be more like, this kind of language is not appropriate for this or whatever. But yeah, no, the difficult thing is just consistency, like making sure you do a little bit every day and try and like put down words. And I am of nature a fiddler, so I will, as with drawings, I tend to overwork things unless I set myself specific deadlines. Because you see something and you're like, but I could do it better. I could do it differently. I have ideas, and you go back and you do things again and again and again. And in the same way with writing, like I go back and if I open like one of my chapter documents and I start writing, and I'll see like a sentence, I'm like, oh, I can write that differently. And suddenly you've spent like 4 hours just like editing yourself, and you haven't actually made anything new. So there's that thing of there's an old Jewish proverb of saying like do a good deed and throw it on the wind, which I think holds some truth. Like that thing of don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Do good stuff. Nothing is ever perfect, and perfect is also boring. There's a fantastic band called Steely Dan. They made one of the greatest albums of all time called Aja, and they spent months and months and months and months and months and months and months on the editing of it, to the point where they had made it perfect. And then they realized that perfect was boring, and so they had to start messing it up in creative ways. And that's interesting, I think that realization of like, if you achieved perfection, you'd probably be pretty bored with it. So maybe just leave the edges rough, and maybe just try weird stuff and see where it goes. And you can always polish, but if you don't have to, that's better.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe perfection. I think perfection should always be on the horizon. If you can no longer see it, then you've fallen off the edge of the world, and there's kind of like no point anymore. So it's kind of having like, the carrot on the stick, so to speak. Regarding the writing process you just mentioned, and obviously diving into that space, is it kind of the same, but all internally with yourself, or at least with this project? Like when you're on a project, like you're trying to have those conversations around context with your art side, and obviously your like trying to write this thing, and it's like, is it kind of this weird abstract thing that you've described in studio, but happening now basically inside of your creative brain?
Kind of. I mean, you'd think, wouldn't you? I think the thing is that like the world of Tine kind of already exists, right? It's real up here, so I don't really need to do all of those steps anymore, because I know what it looks like. I just have to like show it to other people now. And that means, you know, I mean, I know what it looks like from 10,000 feet. But then, like, if you ask me to, like, go and, like, what does that thing look like? Then I'm like, well, I know, but I just have to, like, show you now. So, like, all of the, I could close my eyes and kind of be there. And it's not like a magic trick. Like, it's not like it's fully realized, but all of its context and all of its contents are there. So I know what it would have to be like. I just have to kind of build it out for you. So it's more about, it's always a bit presumptuous, like compare yourself to other artists, but I do love Miyazaki a lot. And he does this thing where he just like, he'll talk in animation. So he'll say, you know, like the reason why a view is beautiful is that you could play yourself in animation by following a set of details, for example. And it's sort of like that. It's more that I have to play the movie that it's eventually maybe going to be, or something, like whatever it is, like the series of events, things. It just has to play out up here. And then I have to just like find words to describe that. And I think a more seasoned and smarter and maybe cleverer writer would think more about, you know, like your hero's journey and the building of tensions and all that stuff. And I'm sure that's a good idea. But I never cared about that. That never mattered to me. Like, I know that stuff matters. I've seen movies where I've seen analysis of these movies, and I can tell you exactly where these tensions are supposed to be. And I cannot tell you how much it does not matter to me. Like, Christopher Nolan's Batman movies are fantastic movies. I know. They are. And yet, what matters to me about them is that Batman got to be real, not a comedy prop, right? Like, that's what matters to me. Because I could sit and I could watch Batman and not be like, Mr. Freeze or whatever, right? Like, that, because that was the weird thing about Batman in the olden stuff, right? And the cool thing about Batman in the comic books was that Batman got to be like badass and cool. And the other ones, he was like badass and cool, one step removed through like a comedy veneer. And the thing Nolan did was like make it truly believable. Like, you could look at that stuff and you needed to make no effort to suspend your disbelief, because it slapped, right? And I think part of the reason why like his later movies maybe have slapped less, except for Oppenheimer, was that he essentially took like a coolness test after that. He was like, can I get away with anything? I can just get away with everything, right? Like Tenet. And so it's a weird movie. And it's fine. But what was I trying to say? Yeah. So the thing about like writing is that like Max, my writing coach guy, like he tells me all those things, and I try to inculcate some of it. I try to like, you know, improve my sentence structure and all of these things that I think matter. When I read through my own text, I want it to not be a chore. So I try to write in ways where like my eye can travel across it and all of these things. But ultimately, if I was trying to become like a good writer in an academic sense, I probably would approach this very differently than I'm doing. But I'm trying to just write the thing that's in my head. And I'm not trying to say like, oh, I'm being like, you know, like there's a way of saying this where it makes you sound like, you know, a bit like artistically, I don't know, like overly ambitious, like, oh, I'm doing it the real way or whatever. No, it's more like I don't think I could do it the other way. Like, there's a reason I never went to like an art academy to learn how to draw, because that kind of drawing doesn't appeal to me, right? Like my lines are not clean, but they are clear. So in the same way, like my writing is probably not like the cleanest writing in the world. But I'm just trying to like hash it out to the point where it's no longer so egregiously wrong that people can't read it. And so beyond that, I want to just like write something that's cool, and then we'll see how we can sort of make it better or whatever. But that's the basic idea, because like it's the same with drawing. It's like the best drawings are the drawings that make the most out of the simplest stuff. Again, like Kim Young-gi, nothing of the stuff Kim ever did was like fancy. It's just simple stuff. Everything is completely simple. And if you, to anybody watching, if you want like the best drawing instruction of all time, you are lucky to be living in the time of the YouTubes. You can go on YouTube, you can search for Kim Yoon-gi lessons, and there's like hundreds of episodes, some for an hour, some for 5 minutes, where he did just online courses where people called in essentially, and he would talk them through how to solve their drawing issues. And so if you want instruction in drawing, like, you don't need to go anywhere else. You can just go to YouTube, you can watch those videos. It's worth more than anything. And you will see how even the most like fantastically complex looking drawings of his were just amalgams of extremely simple considerations overlaid, because layers of simple information creates the illusion of the complex, right? It's the same thing that I like to try and do with like world building or writing or drawing or whatever. It's just complexity shouldn't be complex. Complexity should be dismantleable into simple elements, like good engineering. I guess I am my parents' son after all. They're both engineers.
No, I think, well, that actually does make sense, especially the way you explained throughout the episode the things that matter to you and at least the questions that you need answering. For example, you just mentioned obviously a few moments ago just history, a nice little mini but clearly deep dive into history, and I'm sure a lot of groups of people that people have never heard of before, because you said they stop at Romans and that's it. It kind of stops there. How important, like, does history draw you in? Like, have you always been interested in history?
Oh yeah, I mean, more so after I got out of school. Okay. Not that I was in a bad school or anything, but like just the idea that history was a bunch of dates kind of is such a turn off.
Yeah.
History, I mean, because history is everything. Everything up until a second ago is history, right? And unless we want to sort of fall into the idea of like pure free will and stuff, we are just shaped by everything that everybody did before. So history is everything. If you want to understand all of the stuff that seems mercurial and mystical and weird about the world today, look at what made us get to this point, right? And so the reason I think history is interesting is because like human beings are interesting, but also like what have human beings been doing and why and how. Mm-hmm. So making sense of stuff, right, is kind of the thing that really sort of gets me going. So whenever a historical period, for example, is like referenced in design, there's a very sort of clear turn off switch for me, which is like, did you understand the source material to the point where you could explain it in a way that would make it cool in the way that it was cool to the original users of that aesthetic? A good example of this is like late medieval, early Renaissance fashion, which is, lambasted constantly because of like the broad hips on men and the skinny mid bits and the capes and stuff, right? The ruffs, right? It looks silly. It looks very weird to our eyes. And so if you don't know the context, it looks silly. It really, I mean, look at some portraits from like, 16th century Dutch merchants and their like frills and stuff. It looks insane. But then it looks insane because you don't know what's going on. It looks insane because we simply don't know. So it's absurd. It's absurdist humor. But then if you go 1,000 years before then, and you start looking at, okay, well, what did they wear and why? How did it come to that? And you can go back to the very beginning of clothing, obviously. But if you then look at the transition of over time, what changes in society, what changes in the world, what changes in the manufacture of clothing, why does this become the thing you wear? And the same thing, like, you look at the last 100 years, right? The transition from essentially like a suit and work clothes based clothing culture into leisure wear, into the reaction to leisure wear, into now sort of the re-emergence of like strong centered middle class fashions. All these things are reactions to one another. And reactions to things like fast fashion, all that kind of stuff. And like, you can sit down, you can have those discussions for hours. But the point being that all of these things are movements upon movements upon movements that seem very complex. But again, it's just the overlay of very simple movements and counter movements throughout history. And if it's true for clothing, then it's true for food, and it's true for philosophy, and it's true for fucking everything. So if you if the the one of the greatest proponents of this kind of thinking is Sir Bertrand Russell, who the guy who proposed like the Russell's teapot theory and stuff. If you don't know that was kind of fun, so I'll explain it. It is the idea that if anyone tells you you cannot disprove the existence of God, you have to accept that. That's fair. You can't disprove a negative. Fair enough. But in the same way, no religious person can disprove the existence of a teapot in an orbit around Jupiter in such a way that we would never see it from Earth. It can't be disproven. And yet, if I was to live my life in the belief and base my life on that belief and whatever corollaries we draw from that, that would be an insane thing to do, right? So basing your life on the negative of a non-disprovable negative is a bit of it's a difficult one. But anyway, he wrote a fantastic book called A History of Western Philosophy, which is, I think, one of the best philosophy books ever because it is so irreverent. It's essentially a look from the break of the 20th century back in time on philosophers of sort of the great previous philosophical ages, and then on generally his contemporaries, on people like Goethe and Nietzsche and all these like people who essentially in the breaking of the imperial mindset in Europe started purporting some pretty insane fucking philosophies and essentially just pointing to like where they come from, what is the idea reacting to, and why is it insane? And it's great writing and great reading. So if you have time and want to make the effort, then read that book because it'll make you never feel like you have to keep up with philosophers ever again. Yeah. Because philosophers are just people who like to think out loud.
Yes, that's absolutely amazing. And for your own world building, is it essentially just based on your observations and you kind of like not just put your own things in place of history, for example, but I guess is your philosophy in world building essentially built on the things that you've read and observed about humanity and people in general?
That's where it starts, no doubt. But then it becomes more of a, if I take this but do that kind of thing, right? So there's a bunch of different people. I have one set of people called the oxalots, for example, who's they're based loosely, or at least the original idea of them was based loosely on this sort of Iberian people called the Tarbelli. And I just thought that was funny because Tarbelli made me think of like, okay, why would anyone be called a Tarbelli? Like clearly there's something to do with like the belly and something black. So like, okay, what happened? Okay. Blood sacrifices are obviously something dark we can play with. If people eat a lot of blood and then vomit it up, it comes up black. Okay, tar belly, tar. So then that became like a whole thing where I just like, okay, that's such flavorful fucking nominative determinism that I wanted to play. So I started playing with them, and I made up this like story about this like religious schism that had essentially kind of like with Mormonism in upstate New York, like it drove a bunch of people kind of fucking insane for a couple of decades, and then they were driven out of New York. And it's sort of the same thing here, but just with lots of weird religious overlay and blood sacrifices of cattle. And so you start there and you're like, okay, how do I fit them in? What do I do with them? They seem so gruesome. How can I make that fun? Okay, I'm going to put them in a situation where they seem like your classical fantasy villain thing. But then because this isn't classical fantasy, we're going to have to like undercut that somehow. So we'll see what we do with them. I have ideas, but we haven't really gotten that far yet. Or, as I mentioned before, like these marchers guys, right? They're, again, like a nominative determinism is of course bonk in our world, but it is fun to play with. So a march can, of course, be like people marching together. It can also be a stretch of lowland. It can be a disputed territory. And so it can be like lots of different things. It can even be a dance. So these people then are based around all of the corollaries of that word that I liked to fuck around with. There's another people called like the Kvadaros, So an us is just an us, an in-group. A kvad is a Norwegian, is a Scandinavian term for like a saga or saga telling. So these are the battle bard people. They are the people who tell kvads. There is the talmnonis. A talm is just an old Germanic word for tree, and nonis is from the samnonis, is the people of the old trees. So they people who pray particularly to oak trees, and do this thing that like Nordic people would do, would that they would take the heads of honored enemies and like hang them in trees and sort of decorate these trees with them. And so like again, from the external, that seems pretty fucking gruesome, but to them, it's like a heroically sort of honorable thing to do. And also because that you know, and then that was like the beginning of that. But then I came across just this term again, like talm train, seemed to me to be like a wonderful little turn of phrase. So then I was like, okay, what do I do with that? And little by little that became like another part of their story where they are the one of the three wandering people that like have domesticated horses in a very particular way, and rather than like so again like horses are interesting both historically and in fantasy, right? Because most, and I know I'm ranting, don't worry.
No,
but so like a lot of what we do as fantasy creators is like, okay, you're like, okay, I want to write about horses. I want to like stipulate about horses. I better go learn something about horses. So you go to like a horse person around you. And usually these will be people who are either trained in like the European style of horsemanship or the American style of horsemanship, both of which are coercion-based horsemanship traditions. But that's not the only way to go about it. You have you have like the sort of Mongol, the sort of steppe-oriented way, which is sort of terror-based, which is a bit weird too. But then you have like the Argentinian, the gaucho way, which is almost more like tricking and seduction, which I so adore. Like it has its brutal bits too. But still, like it's so different. They want to maintain the wildness of the horse. They don't want to have like we use the term to break a horse, for example, right? They would abhor that term. They want to keep the horses wild and then sort of seduce them into service for a bit and then release them back to the flocks. So instead of having like pastures for their horses, they have wild areas where the flocks run free. You know, and they call it like running rogue, and so fantastic. So like obviously when I started reading about the gauchos, I was like, oh, I got to use that. So these guys, the Talmones, they are then the people who instead of well, they're essentially like gauchos, but also like barbarians, but not quite gauchos. But it's the same sort of mentality about like they have their horses, they run wild and sort of have to be gathered in, and that's part of the life cycle. And there's also because of the seduction bit, then I was like, oh yeah, trickster gods. You know, they need to have something. So I started thinking about okay, how do I overlap like trickster gods with like trees? And of course, like you have Loki, who's like you kind of go to for like Nordic gods, but I didn't want to go that directly. So I was thinking more about like, okay, how do I do this inside the Tine world? And again, I don't want to like give anything away, but if anyone watching starts like following the whole Tine thing, there is definitely like a link between like oak trees and like godlike mentalities going around. So we'll see where that goes. But yeah, lots of that kind of stuff.
That is absolutely fascinating and absolutely amazing. Very rich creative fuel as well, for sure. Sadly, we've run out of time, so we have to wrap up.
Oh.
Before I get some final thoughts from yourself, top three at this moment in time, obviously, tops, anything always constantly change and shift. Top three books or resources, especially like on history, that you would recommend anyone to check out.
Okay, so there's a couple of things. There's a lecture series at the Great Courses Plus, which I think is called like Wondrium now. I think they might be on YouTube too. They're just called Big History. And they're essentially the sort of avoiding, when you start researching like ancient history, you get into like, Stone Age and Bronze Age and Neolithic and whatever, right? And that can be very confusing because kind of like with all other jargon, it sort of sets you in a weird place. Now you have to become someone who reads about Bronze Age and so on. So Big History kind of just goes away from all that and just says like, hey, we start over here. And then we're just going to look at the movements of people and the general impact that biomes and movements and interactions have. And it's a very interesting way to learn about history without having to deal with all of the boring things like numbers and names. And that's fabulous because it's essentially like a map and like movement patterns. And I think it's like 21-hour lectures where they draw it out for you. So I would, anyone who wants to like get into history, I would just start there. It's a little bit like, like Fun with a Pencil by Loomis if you want to get into drawing. It's just like a wonderful basis by which to start and you can sort of move on. Then in terms of like just fun history books, to sort of get you going, something that just like is sort of fun and juicy. I think one that kind of just kicked me in the nuts in like the best way, which isn't really a history book. It's a historical fiction book, but it does all of the work of a fantasy novel, but it's very well historically researched. It's 2 books. It's called The King Must Die and The Bull from the Sea. It's by this writer, Mary Reynolds. And she takes the myth of Theseus, the guy who goes to Crete and has to fight the Minotaur and stuff. But it strips out all of the supernatural, essentially allowing you to see how the characters would see the supernatural things by essentially mistaking what they're seeing. But she is clever enough to kind of like look at you as her audience and say like, see how that was? Wink. It's great. To go to the less fictional side, I would also say if you want to like get into something like Vikings, for example, but see how you can get away from all of the national romanticism that has kind of poisoned that discourse over the last 100 years. There is The Children of Ash and Elm, which is a fantastic book. But I think the book that has recently sort of really baffled me and got me into a period of history that I was never really into before. Sort of the late 1800s have just never been anything I cared about because it's so close to the First World War. I never really sort of got into it. But there's a wonderful book called The Pike by, I can't remember her name, the writer, but she's fantastic. But it's about this guy, Gabriele D'Annunzio, who, it's too long story to tell now, but it's, he was essentially like the national bard of Italy up into the First and then into the Second World War. He was a poet, a playwright, and an absolute lunatic. And after the First World War, he essentially went like full Napoleon, took his private army of followers and fans, and marched into what is today Croatia, and essentially claimed the city called Fiume that before the war, the Entente powers had promised to Italy because Italy had fought so badly, they kind of took back the promise. And he was so pissed off, he was like, no, we're gonna have it anyway. So for like 18 months, he established a utopia that turned into such a fucking weird dystopia that it became like an abject lesson in why, essentially, why proto-fascism, he was a proto-fascist, why proto-fascism like should be avoided at all costs, but then everybody took like the wrong lesson from it. So essentially like 3 major historical figures that take him as like massive inspirations to themselves are Mussolini, Hitler, and goddamn Lenin. Like they all sent him gifts and were like huge fans and stuff. The dude has been completely forgotten everywhere outside of Italy, but he was like the Elvis Presley of his time. Everyone knew who he was, and he commented on everybody. One of the most prolific writers. And like, if you want an abject lesson in 1, why history forgets people, because they're terrible people, and 2, just how weird the world was before the First World War, read about Gabriele D'Annunzio. The dude explains so much about how we ended up with those 2 world wars. Because like, there were clearly some people with some mindset that just needed to have their teeth kicked in a bit to sort of realize that like, hey, war is not a good thing. It's actually very bad. And now we've settled that, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Just checking everything. Yeah. Fascinating. Those are definitely going to be searched today and definitely gotten or wherever, how I'm going to get them. Everything's been absolutely amazing. Before we head off, any final thoughts and words from yourself to the listeners, or last bits of advice, and obviously shout out about anything that you're doing, got coming up, and all that good stuff.
Nothing specific. If anyone gets interested in the whole like world building or concept building thing, I'm doing probably a workshop in Berlin next year with the drink and draw people. So I'll post that up when that becomes a thing on the schedule. Other than that, like, just make cool stuff, people. That's all it's about.
Evan, thanks so much. It's been incredible.
Cheers, man. Thanks for having me.
A huge thanks to Evan for jumping on. Hit the links to see what Evan is up to, and I highly recommend you check out Tine. Then, when you're done, head to learnsquare.com and enrich your creative journey by taking your next course. Remember, all of our first lessons are free. I've been your host, Aaron Danda. Till next time.